On the first day of my Philosophy 101 class, I asked my students this question. Does life make any sense?
This is going to be a very different PragerFU because we're never going to get beyond this one question. We're not going to look at the rest of the video, at least not this time. We're going to spend all of our time here looking at this one nonsensical question from Professor Owen Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
A freaking philosophy professor who should absolutely know that his question makes no sense. First of all, life is, in its specifics, a very different experience for all of us. Certainly, this is true for all the different species of life on Earth. I suspect that some people born into great wealth and privilege who experience a minimal amount of suffering and struggle might think that this life makes perfect sense, whatever that means. But given the variety of possible life experiences, there can't really be a single answer to this question. Unless you're religious. The cause for which Mr. Anderson is arguing in this PragerU video, the Judeo-Christian religions in particular. In light of Mr. Anderson's question,
Mr. Anderson,
I thought we'd take a look at the Judeo-Christian answer to our professor's query and analyze it in light of what the Judeo-Christian religions teach. Does life make any sense? First off, according to the Judeo-Christian myths and legends, you have to imagine an immaterial being existing outside time and space, neither of which exist yet. And yet, despite there being no time, this being at some point in time allegedly made a decision to create our universe.
The instant that such a decision is made, time comes into being.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson,
Can a decision be made in the absence of time? Does that make any sense? Then, according to the Judeo-Christian myths and legend, this being, God, brought the earth out of chaos and created two people to live in his perfect world. But despite God's hatred of sin, he also created a third evil being who told the other two to disobey God, causing all of the people who came after to be morally impaired, lovers of sin and wickedness, without any possibility of living as God would have them live. Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson,
Does that make any sense? After some time, this all-knowing God finally got fed up with all the sin and wickedness. He somehow found himself filled with grief and regret, wishing that he'd never made us, the humans, despite the fact that he knew all along exactly how things would go. So he decided to wipe out all the humans save Noah and 7 other lucky souls, taking a do-over. But he failed to make any of the necessary upgrades, making things worse by downsizing the gene pool drastically. So no surprise, we all went back to our wicked, sinful ways. Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson,
Does that make any sense? Later, God picked a people to make his very own, whom he allowed to be enslaved for 400 years in Egypt, though he did eventually rescue his people, miraculously making their exodus possible. And he finally gave his people instructions on how to live so that they wouldn't be so wicked and sinful. This included prohibitions on murder and stealing, after which he ordered them to murder entire populations so that they could steal their land. Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson,
Does this make any sense? Finally, according to the Christian myth and legend, God decided to fix everything by impregnating a young girl with himself. As a fully God, fully human being, he would eventually have himself tortured, murdered, and rise from the dead so that we could all be saved. If we believe this legend, for which God left us without even a single eyewitness. Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson,
Does any of that make sense? Clearly, if you're looking to make sense of life, the Judeo-Christian myths and legends aren't going to do it. An all-good, all-powerful being creating a world filled with... Shoot, how did Prager put it again?
This life is filled with an immeasurable amount of injustice and suffering.
Isn't that all you really need to know? Worse yet, the Christian God had to know that creating would lead to the vast majority of his sentient beings suffering eternal conscious torment. So, Mr. Anderson,
Mr. Anderson.
I'll ask you one last time. Does any of this make any sense at all? Does it not make far more sense to believe we're all living in the Matrix? Once again, I'm me. Thanks for watching.